Hi, Sayas. Thank you for agreeing to guest in my podcast. Can you tell us more about what the queer brown vegan is and how you started?
Queer Brown Vegan actually began back in 2019. I graduated with an environmental science degree in 2018 from Berkeley, and I remember very clearly I couldn't find a job in the environmental sector. I actually got rejected from all the environmental NGOs that you can think about, and I actually ended up getting a job at a creative agency in New York City. So I got this very weird for an environmentalist to start working in the creative industry right out of college, but it was something that was very unique opportunity that I got just through networking. And so when I moved there and I started doing all these like creative campaigns, whether that was for like brands like in fashion or like watches, just like so many endless products, I started to realize how empty I felt inside of myself of like did not feel accomplished. And so Queer Brown Vegan came a year after I graduated because I realized that there was this need for me to talk about environmental education without the need of feeling like I needed a real job to do it. And so social media presented a lens for queer brown vegan to talk about these issues without it being so institutionalized. It was a very decentralized, open access, very simple for the common general Instagram user that they can connect to. And it was something where I felt like I told myself behind the screen, like maybe it could be my job one day, but I didn't fully believe in that. I just said maybe it'd be great for it to be my job. And yeah, fast forward years later, it's been my full time job for the last, I think, since last 4 years now. And it's been very thankful on that end to be able to talk about that through an independent creator lens on that end.
hmm And you were recently in London organizing an event, right? Could you talk more about that event that you had in London called It's Symbiocene?
Yeah, absolutely. The Symbiocene was co-founded and co-created by my co-founder Kalpana Arias from Nowadays on Earth and myself. And basically, the idea around Symbiocene is it was coined by Dr. Glenn Albrecht, who is an environmental philosopher, and he characterizes the Symbiocene as this era that goes beyond the Anthropocene that looks at how species come together to flourish, right? It's a period of time where we come as a symbiosis together. The issue with the Anthropocene, right, is that for starters, the International Union of Geological Sciences has declined to even accept the term Anthropocene. Yet, as a society culture, we've adopted Anthropocene because it opens up this doom and gloom narrative, right? It says the current emissions and the current degradation of environments is our fault, right? From human to human, we've destroyed it, which to a sense, yes, we do contribute to environmental damage. However, it's not really illustratively of the corporations and institutions that have one perpetuated neo-colonialism or colonialism, slavery, the depletion of these natural ecosystems through this giant global capital structure lens. And so the Symbiocene Summit was a way to really kind of go beyond the simple climate or environmental event and to really unpack different conversations that apply to individuals who may not have backgrounds in environmentalism and to really kind of question different topics from religion, spirituality, like psyche, like the brain, like adaptive intelligence. And so for us, it's not so much like we brand it as a climate or environmental event, but we do have a large audience of people who are environmentalists or who are interested about learning about the environment. And what we found is that when you give people the agency of exploring different conversations that really push beyond those boundaries, I've found that more people feel invested in the program versus this idea of like, what's your carbon footprint? How sustainable are you? What can brands do? And it's like, we don't want those conversations anymore because the symbiosine isn't really about that. It's about really our relationships and what we think about these different topics.
As a queer person, and it was recently Pride Month, right? As a queer person, do you think that the climate crisis, the climate issue, is something that the queer community talks about, or do we not talk about it as much as we should?
I think my view, the dominant, and I'll talk from America perspective because I don't want to talk from other countries, but I think in America, the issue with Pride Month is that it's a very corporatized month, and so that means that from a creator lens, a lot of creators get employed during that time, and I only got one job this Pride Month as a LGBT creator, which it wasn't disappointing. It was just like this is how it's always been in the industry. It changes. But what I will say is that the the LGBT movement struggles to connect it with environmentalism is that we as queer and trans people have been isolated from environmentalism because of homophobia and transphobia and anti-LGBT laws that deem us as unnatural, right? So we already are seeing that narrative of like what is natural versus unnatural. But the second thing I'd like to say is that the reason that we really forget to kind of stick to it is that we also forget the ways in which we consume. So Pride Month, right? The Pride merch is made with slave labor, and it's been noted that in global South countries, many of our queer and trans um, siblings are the ones creating these clothes and getting paid less while we wear it, and it says liberation or free the rainbow, right? And so that's a unique dichotomy where it's like I think if we were able to connect it more to the human experience versus the non-human animal species at first, right? I think that kind of draws a connection because that means that yes, we should be caring. And the last thing is to kind of note that we don't really think about the environments we live in, right? Tear gas and all these like militarized equipment that's used against queer and trans communities during protests are environmental pollutants, are factors of environmental racism, but that's also when they come back home, because many queer and trans communities already face high rates of homelessness, they're usually forced to live in low income poverty areas, or some of them already grew up in those areas that live in toxic sites that produce low air quality levels. And so there's that question where I think that it's not so much I think that they don't care. I think it's the way that it's being angled and presented isn't really as accessible as it could be. But the second thing is that the environmental movement has done such a poor job to engage with these communities because of homophobia and transphobia that makes them distance themselves to say, let's not talk about our race. Let's not talk about our sexual identity in these spaces.
So it flattens the discussion essentially in the context of like unity and like we have to it's Pride Month, like we have to celebrate, but at the same time, like we flatten all of the discussions in the I guess like guise of like promoting, I don't know, queer inclusion and all of that. I want to talk about like you mentioned about natural and natural, and I was watching your videos recently and you were talking about queer ecology. Can you talk more about what it is and basically like what concept it posits?
Yeah. Queer ecology is a very unique concept. I'll be honest, when I first learned it, I was so confused. It's a very academically dense, and when I mean dense, I mean like it's very like heavy in terms of like it's so much really rich information. The way I see it in characterize queer ecology is that it reanalyzes and challenges the power structures that we have in our human society. So what queer ecology is saying is that yes, that in non-human species we can see the ways in which organisms, animals, flowers, and fungi detest against uniformity, right? And when I mean uniformity, I mean that what structures are in those kingdoms. It is very important to note that gender in human species is a social construct, right? It's heavily influenced by social political norms, but these non-human kingdoms do not follow that, which is why it's important for me to say that because I think that when I talk about queerness, I'm examining it through the sex lens, but it's also not to reinforce again the binary structures of what makes a male and woman. But in this case, with non-human species, and queer ecology is saying that these species do not grow in uniform structures. They don't grow perfectly. They don't grow in certain ways. These kingdoms do not behave in those ways. Now, that's the metaphorical example that we could use for many queer and trans communities. Is that for myself, growing up and having to like garden as a teenager in LA with my dad and brother, I saw me, removing species like fungi and weeds, quote unquote, that are bad for these uniformity green lawns in America as a way of destroying myself and trying to say like this is how I'm trying to conform. Now, in theory, that what we're trying to say with queer ecology and in practice is that there's no such thing as an unnatural being in an unnatural world, because as nature we see that there we respond to events as the ways that we see ourselves. And so for me, I think that the power structures that we are created today with homophobia and transphobia fall under the same umbrella of white supremacy. White supremacy itself gave birth, right? Settler colonialism gave birth to this categorization, this hierarchy of what was seen. And this is early days of documented within indigenous peoples worldwide of the ways that colonization and settlers tried to strip away not only their food sources and their cultural identities, but they're also their identities of how they saw themselves in gender. And we know this because in indigenous cultures, some of them have third genders, some of them have what you would say two spirit, which isn't so much of like being male or female, but rather this detesting against the gender norms that we see today. And so I think that the reason why queer ecology allows us to really reorient ourselves is that it allows us to understand that we as beings are so much more above these hierarchies. And so when we're trying to challenge these hierarchies and these power structures, then we're met with this notion of unnaturalness. And so for us to begin deconstructing that narrative is to embrace our unnaturalness and to understand there is no such thing as quote unquote one thing being natural, because unnatural means that it's not living in the system. But to me, unnatural means that it is a living system that does not conform to our heteronormative structures here in America or globally.
Yeah. It's interesting because I was actually reading a book before that said like you cannot prohibit anything that exists within nature because like that would be breaking the laws of physics, right? Like anything that exists, it's natural. So there's no such thing as a natural that exists in nature because it exists. But I want to talk about like how, that desire, the human desire to like organize, and by organizing societies, like we often like brand things as good, evil, like, like bad, good. Um how can we reconcile like our queer existence that doesn't cleanly fall into like the structures that already exist, like obviously like we do not cleanly fall into like cis heteronormative like structures. So how do we reconcile that? Like does it how do we envision dismantling the system?
Yeah, I think for me, when I talk about queer ecology, I use it as more of the praxis because I think that queer ecology did such an illustrative job in showcasing like the ways that we see it. But I think with queer sustainability, for me, the way I see it is like the practice of that. So for me, I think that one of those ways is through reclamation and independence. Reclamation to me isn't so much of claiming land ownership or those things, but to rather reclaim cis heteronormative spaces that are often seen as violent for queer and trans communities. One examples of that that's used actually very illustratively with queer geographies and queer ecologies is parks. Parks represent these like heteronormative structures for the nuclear family in America. And so what we're trying to say is that queer and trans people have often found it difficult to connect themselves with nature because the public places that we offer to them are often for cis heteronormative families. And so for me, one example of queer sustainability is redesigning the ways that we see parks. And redesigning our relationships is by visiting them and giving them agency to understand the relationships around there, whether that's through outdoor education of being able to identify plants, animals, whether that's either to even celebrate their birthdays and gatherings for their communities. And I think that there's this like negative stereotype of like, oh, it's a queer trans community, like they're gonna just do misconduct behavior, when we know that there's literally like so much demonization around that and prejudice that's against these communities. And the second thing for me with queer sustainability, what I like to always say too, is the ways in which we show up for ourselves, right? And I don't mean individually, but for communities. Right now, I think that there's a lot of issues with our communities in the LGBT spaces that allow us to further separate ourselves from these communities. And I think one way to really bring that together is through community based events that offer these ecological wealth opportunities. I think that in my experience, many of my friends who are in the LGBT spaces are sober free people, or who did previously engage in long-term substance abuse and now have found themselves like choosing a sober life. Yet I think that we do have an issue with drug and alcohol abuse, but the same thing can be said within heteronormative communities. Like it's like, like, I think that the characterization of us is so unique because we're told that we want to be free and that we're together, but we've been oppressed for decades, which is why there's so many issues within communities on that end too. The last thing for me, to rewrite those narratives is simply not to conform to the same values that what heteronormativity looks like. Like, I think that this idea of, not to say that wanting a family is bad. I think that we have to understand how our love of relationships is actually look like, whether that's cooperative models of living with your best friends together, whether that's like co-community land ownership of ensuring that queer and trans communities have investment to own farmland, to build their own localized food systems, or whether that's through this idea of, in my view, like bringing people within certain environments and natural resource places for them not to have, I don't mean ownership, but to have symbiotic relationships with them. Because for me, when you give agency and power to these communities, that means that they're able to define what resiliency looks like to them. And if we just throw them money, it's not so much a long term sustainable solution. When, in theory, in my view, like, money only goes a long way, short way in that case. Whereas um, property co-ownership and like collaborative partnerships is the way for these communities to build outside that dominant structure that's trying to constrain them, whether that's through like where they buy, who they rent from, what access to resources they get to have.
Mm. I want to talk about, because you mentioned how difficult it was for you as an environmental science major to look for jobs, and I want to contextualize that in with the experience that a lot of queer people in the Philippines are experiencing now. Like, you see a lot of destructive industries, for example, like fossil fuel industries, like Shell. There are a lot of like fossil fuel companies that have started to basically target like the queer community, and by target I mean sort of like encouraging them to join the company, right? Like, they've sponsored pride events, like they do a lot of pride activities. um my question is that, um because these opportunities exist, and like there are a few opportunities that exist for queer people, how do you see us as, where does our responsibility lie in that? Like, do you think that we are responsible? Like, because it's hard to survive, but at the same time, like, we know that in the long term, a lot of these industries will also harm the community.
I love this question mainly because this happened to one of my good friends in college. They work at a fossil fuel, they work at Shell. And I think that it's important for us to be very specific in what we're saying disappointed. I am disappointed of the industry. I'm not so much disappointed at them specifically. Then that's the second level to it. I am broken in some places with my relationship with them. I'm no longer friends with them just because of other reasons, not so much the environmental choice that they did. But I think on my end is that, one is that queer and trans communities have so much trauma. So when an industry comes and offers that financial stability for themselves or for their loved ones, it's a very attractive tool. And so for me, I understand where they're coming from in that sense, is that they need that stability for their family or their partners or whatever. At the same time, I think that there is a better way to approach those conversations with them versus of like interrogating of like, that's an evil company. When I've met people who work in these industries, and I have met them, they exist. Their attitudes are very like, I don't really care. I get to travel the world and be with my boyfriend or be with my girlfriend. And to me, it's like, that's wonderful. No one's trying to take that away from me. What I'm trying to say is that, how sustainable is this life for you at the end of the day, when you know that future generations of other ancestors or future generations to come or your own children are not going to have that future? it's not that they don't care, it's that what is the alternative to that? So for me, what I try to do is like, these are the alternatives that you can work in, whether the clean energy sector, whether that's the foundations and philanthropy, which also has its own issues. But if you're not providing an alternative to them or another safety net system to them, that just means to them that they're not less likely to believe you. And so for me, I think creating a career in independency was really hard because I know that not all queer and trans people are going to be able to do this career I have. Like it's the sad truth. So for me, I work with industries that are good to see how do we get them more funding, how do we get them more amplification, how do they continue to grow. And I think that's the hardest part is that regardless of how much education that you put into these communities, I think that in private conversations you find out why they work in them. And I realize that many of them are, I don't know how to say this. It's not that they're broken, but like they've gone through a lot of hardship. And some of that, whether that's through their family cutting them off, whether that's them being homeless for years, whether that was not having anyone to rely on, they rely community care with corporations, which this is where we as a movement have really failed. Is that not because they're working in these industries, but because for how long do so many queer and trans youth go alone trying to figure themselves out? Why is it that the first thing that they identify with culture is through alcohol, sex, corporations as these forms of safety? And it's not taught. Well, consumption, yeah, and it's taught to them by who? By corporations, but also the dominant cultures that we've prescribed in. Like, let's be honest here for both of us. Like, you know, in America, here myself, like that's how I was introduced in certain ways. I'm not blaming the movement itself, but when I learned more about the history, and I was like, okay, yeah, never mind. That was wrong for me to think about that because of capitalism and consumption. But you realize that their consumption is based on capitalism. So if our consumption isn't based on community care and reciprocity, then they're more likely to not give a f about these industries and where they work at, because at the end of the day, for them, it's about being a mantelpiece, what cis heteronormativity sold them, versus trying to be against it and be like, I don't agree with this and goodbye. That's the sad thing. I feel like I don't argue with these people because you know I don't have the solutions to them, but I also tell them like I don't agree with the industry, but that doesn't mean I think they're a bad person. I mean, there are some people who work in those industries that are bad people that I'm like, you're just a horrible piece of being that you know what you're doing. But at the end of the day, like they're just empty inside thinking that a corporation is going to fill their empty heart because they face isolation for a majority of their life versus actually being honest of what they need in their like physical care.
But yeah, I agree. I feel like I know that I also come from a place of privilege. Like obviously, like I was able to make like certain decisions that I feel like are not afforded for like a lot of the people in the queer community in the Philippines. But I also want to think I was also want to talk about like how when we talk about equality sometimes or like more often than not like we talk about equality, so we want to be equal to the oppressors in a way, so we become the oppressors ourselves or we contribute to that the destruction of like yeah, like our environment, like contributing to the climate crisis. Do you think that people should sit with their cognitive dissonance and like sort of, I don't want to say hypocritical, but also like acknowledge the fact that this is helping you survive, but at the same time you should also criticize like the structure that is contributing to the destruction of the climate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something where it's hard. I love this because I think it's an intimate setting where we could talk about it privately. I think that if it was done publicly, it would showcase the cracks within our movements that would allow other individuals to attack us, because I think that's where, you know, I think that when we talk about privileges, like in the global north, we're very focused on the sacrificial of the global south. They're always like equality for us, but I don't know about, you know, everywhere in the global south. That's their country's government's fault. They don't care about them, right? That's what they say usually, which is like so messed up. But for me, I think that like, you know, I have often felt that I've had to address my privileges in a lot of rooms, and you know, from pretty privileged to like colorism, like being like mid light skinned myself, like to even like being cis heteronormative presenting when I'm not speaking. Like there's so many times I've been called as straight in the streets. Like I know visibly how privileged I am to have that. And if you notice that within LGBT spaces, most public speakers that are out there are usually heteronormative, cis, cis presenting individuals. Very few trans people, which needs more visibility. But also, like when it comes to trans people, those who are usually black and brown have the least amount of platforms or reach compared to the white trans public figures that are out there. So I think for me, like when we are trying to address these like biases and these like concerns in our spaces, I've often felt that it is a really difficult conversation to bring up, mainly because I think one is that people are operating through their trauma. Like I have a friend who we talked about it and they said, I've been called ugly all my life. And I said, but that's your childhood trauma that is affecting you. And externally, you don't navigate that way. Like you are you're a assigned model. Like you don't understand like the conversation. What I'm trying to bring is that we cannot build ourselves while we're sacrificing others in these spaces, and yet like I think they had a hard time just understanding that they can also be oppressor. One very unique example of this is that trans communities and lesbian and gay is that we're seeing that even lesbian and gay siblings are sacrificing their trans siblings. They're saying, "Oh yeah, being trans is wrong, but gay and lesbian's fine because you know your gender." And it's like how delusional how those communities have gotten because of misinformation, disinformation, but also the desire to be loved on the other side. And that's where it's sad because we know that conservative and far right groups would unalive us the instant that they had us. Like, doesn't matter if you help them get rid of other people. They'll look at you and be like, all right, you're next because we got rid of them. So we don't need you anymore. It's like the disposability, the desire to be desired in this society versus how the high rates of disposability queer and trans people are to cis heteronormative societies and cultures is very high, and it's on the second that they would get rid of us. And so I think for me, in America we're seeing so much increase of anti-LGBT laws, yet we're seeing so much idea that like gay marriage between same-sex couples is their equality or their justice is where it ends. And it's like, to me, like trans people were always the ones who fought for our rights, and the reason why we have so many rights now we're sacrificing them. And like it's sad to see like many trans heroic figures in the movement died of homelessness. So like when we're trying to talk about our stories of success or our stories of liberation, like for liberation for who and to whom and to what level does that really get to in the long focus? No one, right? Like that's not liberation. That's maybe independence in your mind, but independence from society, no, it does not exist for us. So I do think that because people have been so severely not harmed but like dispossessed in their spaces, they have this affinity to wanting to attract themselves to cis heteronormative powers when they know those cultures will never accept them. And that's just what lies have been told in those spaces.
No, it's interesting because like, a part of the community, like sort of gained validation at some level, and now they're willing to throw everyone under the bus just because like they feel like okay, like we sort of got our rights, or we sort of like got accepted in a way, we got our foot in the door, now we're closing that door behind us and no one can come in. But I also want to talk about like veganism, because like obviously you're the queer brown vegan, and I feel like veganism has been a very difficult topic to talk about, like for me as a queer person, because I try to like show a lot of like people from the queer community that there is an interconnection between like speciesism and like also homophobia and like transphobia, like how we were talking about like structures and like structures of oppression. um Going back to my question, but like sort of like flipping the script in a way, like do you think that queer people need to talk more about or need to be concerned about veganism, if only because like the same script that they use to oppress animals are also the same script that they use like to oppress like the queer community?
I love this question. I think with veganism, my relationship to how it's presented in media and mainstream spaces like has disappointed me. I mean, I think that like it's sad to see of how it's still being defined, but yet I realize if I expend my energy so much within veganism, I'll end up dead in my own world. So I think with veganism, right, like it's all about this extension of power and the ways that we understand liberation and kindness. So veganism to me, the way that I learned it is that it's extension of understanding liberation. Now, the ways that we see non-human or animal liberation exists on the spectrum. So do I think that people who consume meat practice animal liberation to some extent? Yes, but is that limited to their consumption? Yes. But for me, I saw veganism as an extension of understanding it more and compassion and kindness. I don't want to disregard indigenous communities who obviously eat from localized food systems and have this very sacred and deep relationship ways of how they practice consuming non-human animals that I didn't know because my Western understanding in America is just like buy it from a grocery store from a factory farm and that's it. So I don't really know much about their practices, but I respect their practices and acknowledge that I live in a globalized food system here in Los Angeles where I can go vegan, so that's why I adopted it. But I think for me with veganism is that when I learned about speciesism, the ways that it was defined right in academic literature is that it was looking at this mass industrialized effect of capitalism that was using non-human species as a way to experiment, abuse, and test their products on. And the issue with speciesism is that it's now transferred to the individual self. So we call people specious, which is like so useless in my view, like because to understand speciesism is to recognize that the products that even I use and clothing I've used in the past, like come from directly the killing of non-human animals. So to understand speciesism is to understand what was happening during that time. Global capitalism is the existence of giving birth to these industries. And yet I think within veganism, what they've done very horribly is that they've illustrated it to the individual. So in order to their theory, this is where I would say that the racist vegan space is that the theory is that in order for us to achieve animal liberation, it's very focused on the individual self. That means that it's focused on you. But for us to illustratively address the systemic issue is in order to talk about white supremacy and the birth of these industries. When I challenge individuals and I say that, it wasn't it wasn't indigenous communities who created factory farms. It was settler colonizers who had this idea of this. And when I there's a class I took on agroeconomics. This idea of agribusiness was actually created and coined by two white men in America that were settlers that had this vision of privatizing agriculture and creating an industrialized scale model that would benefit the American people, or aka the government and the corporations around it. And so for me, when we talk about speciesism, I do think that speciesism is not the same as racism, because racism, I don't want to characterize them the same, but they fall under the same umbrella of white supremacy. So like it's to say that in my view, like they're all interconnected. All the isms and phobias that we face, from transphobia, homophobia, species racism, like sexism, like they're all convoluted within there. But I would say that in human society, we definitely face more racism than speciesism because of the treatment of how we do towards Black and Indigenous and like marginalized communities that exist. And the last thing I would say is that like with veganism and speciesism, I think the reason why so many queer and trans communities are attracted to veganism is that veganism allows you to understand the power structures, allows you to also understand the ways in which we navigate the world with kindness, but also the relation of non-human species, of the organisms that exist beyond you. And I think the reason why so many of us are connected to them is the ways that we see non-human animals is that they have their own societies, their cultures, but they also do not conform to this society. They're not unaliving each other based on their, their acts or behaviors and things like that. And the last, and I think for me, that's the issue with queer and trans communities, is that I don't think all of them will go vegan. Like that's my understanding is that not everyone will eventually go vegan in the world. I would hope in the future, but to be honest, I don't think that's really like going to be happening anytime soon. But I use veganism as an introduction for queer and trans people because I think that for them to see themselves a part of the environment, they need to understand different levels of oppression. And those different levels of oppression can sometimes come from analyzing non-human species and how that culture itself can also be reflected in a similar way, kind of like it's parallel, like you could draw parallels to structures, but you cannot say it's the same thing of like animals that are, not like animals that are being kept in cages is the same thing as um you know I don't want to get into that conversation around slavery, but like I think that there's a lot of very very problematic things I've seen with vegan spaces where it's like, these are white people who think that they're apparently history 101 masters of slavery and racism. And I'm like, no, they are far beyond those lessons and, in fact, racist. So I don't think that veganism is fully the way for certain queer and trans communities, but I do think that for majority who I've met, like I definitely have met like a lot of queer people who end up being vegan, which is very interesting. I didn't know that at first when I first went vegan. I was like, why are queer people attracted to veganism? And then you realize when you're in it, like, oh, it's because it does offer this different lens of liberation, and then you can relate to it because you've also been isolated in some way.
I notice a lot, like not a lot, but at least like within my circles, for example, like people think that being vegan, like like they think vegan is soy boys, like it's being too feminine, and like that fear that trying to like get out of that like branding that you're too weak or feminine, like is what is causing them to resist like being vegan in the first place because it feels like adding sort of like oppression on top of like an oppression that already exists. So do you think that's valid? Have you seen that happen, or what do you think about that?
I I think within vegan spaces, and this is where I'm very thankful for certain non-toxic masculine cis men who work out and teach other young men that are often straight who won't listen to like queer people like us, but like will listen to like people like them to understand it. I think that goes back to the demonizations of localized food systems, like soy, for example, like has very rich roots in Asia, and like to me, like the anti-Asian rhetoric comes very easily from there. Of America's like we have superior foods here, when we have to remind ourselves that European rich diet was dairy, wine, and cheese. And like they were dying when they came to America, not even America, but the Turtle Island, because they saw squash seeds and indigenous foods as inferior foods to their diet, which is like really laughable in my view. And that's why a lot of them end up dying from disease and everything like that. But I do think that the reason why there's this huge pushback against is the amount of disinformation and misinformation that the big agriculture and big meat puts out there. Like if I'm telling you, there's a funny thing where I was invited by, and I don't think they checked, it was by the dairy industry. They invited me to do a campaign for their got milk to promote healthy bones and stronger muscles for kids, I guess, but for men or young boys. And it's funny because I was like, oh, this is the marketing scheme. And they were offering, I think, 30,000 USD for this campaign. And obviously I said no and I laughed at it. But it was just like this thing where I was like, did they not check the handle? Like it was wild to me that they didn't check on that end. But I didn't want to post it because I didn't want to start drama with anyone. But regardless of that, I do think that it was important for me to understand that we're seeing a lot of young boys being very influenced by homophobia and transphobia, but yet they're also being influenced by the demonization of what they eat. And so it's very weird to me that people who have no degrees in science or nutritional science demonizing food of cultures that they've never eaten. And they go to these grocery stores, these like buff guys, and they talk about what's in your food, and they list out like this ingredient. They're like, it has glucose in it, and it's like that's a chemical. I'm like, none of them has. I've actually taken like any like organic chemistry courses to understand compounds. Like I could go and identify them myself because it's science. But like it's to say that how easily influenced people are in America. I would say America is like the sheeps. We are sheeps of people that just follow people that don't know anything, and then we're like, this is what we learned. I'm like, what, from a guy who has no degree in science and has a gym certificate? Like that's not an expert.
No, it's funny that you mentioned like the demonization of like a non-Western diets. And like I recently became aware, or I should have known this earlier, but like I started to realize this, like, potatoes and tomatoes, which are like the staple of like European diets, like they didn't come from Europe. They were from the Americas. And they were brought to like America, like the potatoes and tomatoes are not part of like they say like Italian culture is like tomatoes, but 500 years ago, potatoes didn't exist in this part of the world. So it's just funny how easy it is to like forget history and also like a basic understanding of it.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think the same with Latin foods. Like cactus is one of those things where I think it's on the come up here in America. And I grew up eating cactus from Mexico my whole life. And it's like insane where people are like, oh, cactus is so good for you. I'm like, I've been eating it for years. Like, I don't know why. Like, I don't know. Maybe they don't season it right, but like some people just don't know how to make it or prepare foods right.
um, Last question. I want to talk about like individual responsibility versus collective action. Like you were talking about like how you feel like how individualized society has become, like all of the burden rests on the individual when we should be talking about like collective action. Like how do we encourage like queer people to see, not just like us, like the queer community, when talking about the climate crisis, like we have to see ourselves as part of like a wider community, and thus like we have to fight for sustainability, like we have to fight against the climate crisis because we know that it's not just us, it's not just the community outside of us that will suffer, but like we will suffer as well.
Yeah, I think the ways that we could really encourage climate, the communities themselves, is through storytelling. I mean, I think, if you look back, is what's the one thing that has always motivated you? It's always been a story. It's never been a fact. I mean, for some people, maybe it is, but like, I don't relate to facts as much. I mean, like, I love them. It's good science, but like, I think the story component is really important. And for me, one of those aspects is actually talking about climate disasters. Is that in America, and there's this really beautiful film. It's called Queer Ecological Floods, or it's by Queering for Climate. It's their documentary that they've been working on for years. I saw this part of the episode where they talk about how these queer and trans communities during the hurricane in America happened in Louisiana, I think, or in a different state. They said that they went to the shelter, and when they went to the shelter, majority of those workers are FEMA or volunteers, like from the Red Cross. And it's not to say that the Red Cross is a Christian organization, but many of these volunteers are religiously political people that are like very much like one way. And they were saying that when we got there, they misgendered them. They didn't allow them to use the other bathroom that they needed to use. They forced them to use that. They were assaulted at the camps by other people. And it's very much like an unsafe place. And so for me, I think that like telling this story was so eye opening to other queer youth because it means to say that regardless if you think you're okay at your home, let's say you get displaced, where do you go? The shelter is gonna have you dead, or slash there's usually immigration ICE police that's there to deport people that are trying to find refuge when safety. It's horrible to me, to hear these stories, but also I feel that it kind of gives this illustrative power to young people to be like, yeah, we really do need to take action here because our safety is going to be over compromised, and we know that when things get worse, we'll be also the first ones to be sacrificing the climate crisis. I mean, just look at the global south, for example. They are sacrificing their poor indigenous communities there. Like, well, who's to say that once, I, God forbid that they're ever, removed from their landscape and that they continue to flourish and resist and that we fight with them. But like, if they're gone, then who's next to protect us? I mean, ourselves, but like, we're usually going to be the next ones in line on that end. So it's not that I put in this very doomist narrative, but it's like a reality to put in for people of like, if you don't can't defend others around you, don't think that they're gonna come to defend you and think that you need to be protected just because you're queer and trans. Like you have to be political. Being queer is a choice of resistance. Identifying and being proud of that, whether internally or externally, means that you know that you're going to fight against a system that wants us to be deleted permanently, by extreme right wing views. And so I think for me, like, being more front facing out there and all the privileges I have, I hope it helps others to be like, you can speak up and I will be there for you to defend you. Because the things I've seen like publicly of what people have said about me, it's insane to me. I mean, it hasn't affected me, but it's been insane to see like how bad people want to see the end of me versus the continued existence of myself in this space. I'm like, okay, well, we'll see what happens here in the future.
Thank you, Isaias, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.